The Galactic Council had seen wars before. They had crushed planetary uprisings, obliterated resistance movements, and stamped out species that dared to challenge their rule. In their cold, bureaucratic arrogance, they viewed military power as a numbers game. Whoever had the largest fleets, the most advanced weapons, and the most soldiers always won. And in their eyes, humanity was nothing. The humans had no vast empire, no planetary dominion stretching across the stars. A single fledgling system on the outskirts of Council space, a backwater species that had only recently clawed its way into interstellar travel. Their forces were laughable, primitive kinetic weapons, outdated warships, and, most absurdly, an army that numbered in the mere thousands. So when the Council deemed humanity an obstacle to be removed, they expected nothing but an easy conquest. A quick suppression. A display of overwhelming force that would remind these upstart creatures of their place in the galaxy. Admiral Zellvacher of the Vernati Dominion sat aboard the bridge of his warship, the unyielding fist, staring down at the blue-green planet below. He allowed himself a smirk, his mandibles clicking in satisfaction. "This is the species that dared refuse our sovereignty," he mused aloud, his voice a low growl. Pathetic. Behind him, his bridge officers, each belonging to a different high-status species of the Council, chuckled in amusement. "Their leaders refused our final ultimatum," one of his lieutenants reported. "They claim that their forces will defend their world to the last." Zellvacher barked out a laugh. "To the last? That won't take long." He turned to the holographic tactical display, which projected a massive red formation over the tiny blue icons representing the human defensive force. The sheer disparity was almost comical. "Their planetary militia numbers less than 50,000, the officer continued. "As for their actual military, they seem to have deployed no more than 1,000 personnel in active combat roles." Zellvacher tilted his head, perplexed. 1,000. "Yes, sir. 1,000 soldiers, spread across several strategic positions. Some of them appeared to be specialists, covert operatives, reconnaissance teams, and unconventional warfare units." A murmur of amusement spread through the bridge crew. A species so weak that they relied on specialists instead of real armies. "Bring up their unit classifications," Zellvacher ordered. The display shifted, pulling up translated files from intercepted transmissions. His gaze swept over unfamiliar human military terms. Some of it was meaningless drivel, infantry, mechanized battalions, air support, but one designation caught his attention. "Unit, United States Army Special Forces, Green Berets." Zellvacher narrowed his eyes. "What are these?" The lieutenant shrugged. "A minor subdivision, sir. A small group of human warriors. Their records indicate experience in asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics, and unconventional operations." The admiral scoffed. 1,000 specialists. Against an empire. The officer smirked. "The humans may be delusional, sir, but they are amusing." Zellvacher shook his head. He had heard enough. Prepare the assault. Drop troops, aerial bombardment, mechanized divisions, crush them quickly. The officer saluted. "Yes, Admiral." The order was given. The war machines of the Galactic Council descended. 2 hours later, Captain Sam Walker crouched low, rifle firm in his grip, watching through the scope as the first wave of enemy drop ships broke through the clouds. The sky darkened with the sheer number of them, massive, insectoid crafts, their armored hulls glinting under the sun. He tapped his earpiece. "They're coming." A gruff voice crackled back. "We see 'em. Stay hidden." Walker exhaled slowly, his heartbeat steady despite the overwhelming force bearing down on them. His team, 15 men, each seasoned in a dozen wars, lay in wait, camouflaged against the rocky terrain. They were deep in the mountains, where visibility was poor and movement was slow. exactly where they wanted the enemy to be. As the first wave of Renati drop ships touched down in the valley below, the aliens emerged in disciplined ranks, tall, armored bipeds wielding plasma rifles and energy shields. They moved like conquerors, confident, unchallenged. They had no idea what they had walked into. Walker raised a clenched fist. His men tensed, hands on triggers. Then he let fall. The first shot rang out. A single bullet, traveling at supersonic speeds, found its mark between the plated sections of an officer's armor. The alien barely had time to register the impact before its head snapped back, body crumpling to the ground. Silence. Confusion. Then chaos. Gunfire erupted from the cliffs, tearing through the unprepared Vernati lines. Explosions followed as well-placed charges detonated in the valley, sending bodies and debris flying. The disciplined ranks of the invaders broke within seconds, their formations collapsing under the sudden, invisible assault. The aliens panicked. Plasma bolts were fired wildly, hitting nothing. They couldn't see their attackers, couldn't track them, because the humans weren't fighting like an army. They were fighting like hunters. Walker adjusted his scope, targeting another officer, and fired. Another clean kill. Move, he ordered, already shifting position. The Green Berets disappeared into the rocks before return fire could even touch them. Below, the Vernati were in full retreat. The first wave had landed with overwhelming numbers and superior technology, and it had lasted less than 10 minutes. Aboard the unyielding Fist, Admiral Zellwacher slammed his fist against the console. What happened? His officers scrambled for answers. Reports streamed in, chaotic, fragmented, impossible to believe. Sir, the first landing force has been routed. Zellwacher's eyes burned. Routed? By 1,000 humans. The officer swallowed. Not even 1,000, sir. Reports indicate that most of the damage was inflicted by a few dozen operators in the mountains. The Admiral leaned in. You mean to tell me that a handful of human warriors just wiped out an entire landing force? The officer hesitated before nodding. Zellwacher's mandibles clicked in frustration. He turned toward the holomap, staring at the enemy positions. Deploy more troops. Twice the numbers. No, 3 times. Flush them out. Burn those mountains to the ground. The Vernati would not suffer humiliation. Not at the hands of these creatures. He clenched his fist. Show them what real war looks like. But as the next wave of alien troops descended upon the planet, the Green Berets had already vanished into the mist, their weapons loaded, their traps set, waiting, ready. And as the first alien soldier stepped into their kill zone, Captain Walker whispered into his radio, "Let's teach these bastards how humans fight." The second wave came at dusk. Captain Sam Walker and his team watched from their vantage point high in the mountains as the enemy force rolled in. Unlike the first wave, which had been confident and unprepared, this one was disciplined. Columns of alien troops advancing in tight formations, their armor gleaming in the dying sunlight. Massive walkers, their insectoid legs clicking against the rocky terrain, scanned the landscape with mounted energy cannons. Overhead, sleek drones drifted in silent arcs, infrared sensors sweeping for human signatures. The aliens were adapting, but so were the Green Berets. Walker exhaled slowly, watching the enemy set up. They weren't making the same mistakes. There were no scattered landing zones, no uncoordinated movements. Instead, they were forming a perimeter, bringing in heavy armor, and scanning for human positions before committing their forces. They thought they had the humans cornered. They thought wrong. Walker tapped his radio twice, the prearranged signal. Time to begin the lesson. Admiral Zellwacher paced the command deck of the unyielding Fist, his patience thinning. The first wave should have been a warning shot, a demonstration of overwhelming superiority. Instead, it had been an embarrassment. Now, his forces were moving carefully, sweeping the region with drones and armored units before committing to an advance. "Admiral," one of his officers called. "Ground forces have begun their assault. Enemy signatures are being tracked in the mountains. The humans appear to be using advanced camouflage and thermal suppression, but our scanners are adapting." Zellweger scoffed. "Let's see them hide from this." He turned to his weapons officer. "Begin artillery bombardment." The order was relayed, and moments later, the sky split apart with fire. The first shells hit the cliffs, sending plumes of dust and shattered rock into the air. The mountain trembled as the bombardment intensified, heavy plasma mortars reducing entire ridges to molten slag. The aliens weren't holding back this time. They were wiping the battlefield clean, refusing to engage the humans on their own terms. Walker and his team pressed themselves against the rocks as explosions erupted around them. He felt the heat against his skin, the concussive force rattling his bones. The aliens had learned, but they had also made a critical mistake. "They think we're still up here," Sergeant Decker muttered. His face was streaked with dirt, eyes scanning the ridgeline. "They're trying to flush us out." Walker grinned. "Let them waste their ammo." The truth was, the Green Berets weren't in the mountains anymore. Not entirely. They had moved, hours before the enemy even arrived. A handful of men remained behind to provide the illusion of a presence, planting false heat signatures, deploying decoys, and drawing enemy attention. Meanwhile, the rest had descended into the valley, slipping past patrols and setting up for the real attack. Now, as the aliens pounded the mountains, Walker's team was already behind enemy lines, and they were ready to strike. The first explosion ripped through the Vernati command post. A towering Walker, its spindly legs reinforced with energy plating, staggered as a well-placed charge detonated beneath it. The blast sheared through its underbelly, exposing fragile wiring before secondary explosives ignited. The war machine collapsed with a deafening screech, its cannons firing wildly into the night before falling silent. Panic rippled through the alien ranks. They spun, searching for an enemy that was no longer where they expected. Then the gunfire began. Walker's team hit them like ghosts. Suppressed shots cut through the darkness, each round finding an exposed weak spot. Grenades arced into formations, sending bodies flying. The humans never stayed in one place, firing, moving, vanishing before the enemy could retaliate. The Vernati commanders barked orders, but their troops were unraveling. "They don't know how to fight a war they can't see," Decker muttered as he reloaded. Walker nodded. "And they never will." Aboard the unyielding Fist, Admiral Zellweger felt his stomach twist as the battle reports streamed in. Casualties rising, formations breaking. An enemy force of less than 1,000 was dismantling his army. He slammed a fist on the console. "How? We outnumber them 100 to 1. His officers hesitated before one of them spoke. "Sir, the humans aren't fighting like an army. They're fighting like predators." Zellweger's mandibles clicked in frustration. The humans weren't engaging in open combat. They weren't holding positions or defending strongholds. They were striking where the enemy was weakest. They were moving faster than his forces could react. And worst of all, they were winning. The night stretched on, but the battle belonged to the Green Berets. Walker's team moved in and out of the Vernati encampments like shadows, disrupting supply lines, destroying vehicles, and assassinating officers with surgical precision. Each time the aliens adjusted, the humans shifted their tactics. Every advantage the Council forces tried to press was turned against them. By dawn, the second wave had collapsed. Hundreds of alien soldiers lay dead. Their command posts were in ruins. Their morale had been shattered, and all around them, the mountains whispered with the ghosts of the soldiers they could never catch. Aboard the unyielding Fist, Admiral Zellweger stared at the casualty reports, his hands trembling. He had never seen anything like this. The Green Berets had done more than fight. They had hunted. They had toyed with his forces, breaking them apart piece by piece. This wasn't war as the Council understood it. It was something worse. Something primal. Something terrifying. Zellweger turned to his officers. Send a message to High Command. Tell them. He hesitated, the words foreign in his mouth. Tell them we need reinforcements. The Galactic Council had believed humanity to be insignificant. Now, they were starting to understand the truth. They weren't hunting the humans. The humans were hunting them. A desperate silence had settled over the valley. Captain Sam Walker knelt on the ridge, scanning the battlefield through his scope. Below, the remnants of the Vernati's second wave huddled in makeshift fortifications, their gleaming armor coated in dust, their once proud banners torn and filthy. They were scared now. Gone was the arrogance, the assuredness of overwhelming strength. The survivors had dug in like cornered animals, waiting for salvation. But none was coming. Walker's earpiece crackled to life. Boss, we got movement. More dropships inbound. He lowered his rifle, eyes narrowing as he saw the incoming vessels. Sleek, obsidian black warships, far more advanced than the ones that had come before. These weren't just reinforcements. This was a purge. The Galactic Council had finally realized its mistake, and now they were here to erase it. Walker exhaled. All right, boys. Let's show them how humans say hello. Admiral Zellweger stood stiffly in the command chamber of the unyielding fist, his tendrils twitching with unease. He had made the call. Summon the paladins. It was an admission of failure, one that clawed at his pride. The paladins were the council's elite enforcers, warriors whose sole purpose was to eliminate insurrections with extreme force. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They arrived, they cleansed, and they left. Now, as their warships descended, Zellweger felt an unfamiliar sensation grip his chest. Dread, because deep down, he wasn't sure if even they would be enough. The moment the paladins hit the ground, the battlefield transformed. Their armor was heavier, blackened with battle scars, their weapons bristling with alien technology. They moved with terrifying precision, sweeping through the ruins, their plasma blades cutting down anything in their path. They didn't march like soldiers. They hunted like executioners. Walker and his team had seen a lot in their time. But even they had to admit, these bastards were good. Too bad good wasn't going to be enough. The first engagement lasted only seconds. The paladins breached the human perimeter with surgical efficiency, their energy shields deflecting small arms fire. Two of Walker's men were cut down instantly, their bodies burning away to nothing. Walker snarled, "Fall back." Now, they didn't need to be told twice. The team scattered, vanishing into the landscape, shifting to guerrilla tactics. Hit, fade, hit again. The paladins pursued, but they weren't used to this kind of war. They were accustomed to breaking armies, not chasing ghosts. Walker's men struck from the shadows, using terrain, explosives, and sheer cunning to dismantle the enemy. A tripwire sent one paladin sprawling into an explosive charge. A well-placed sniper round slipped through a visor slit, dropping another. Still, they kept coming. Relentless, efficient, cold. It was a war of attrition now, and that meant it was time to change the game. Aboard the unyielding fist, Admiral Zellweger watched the carnage unfold. His elite forces should have crushed the humans within minutes. Instead, the humans were adapting, learning, and countering with terrifying speed. Then the reports came. One paladin lost, then another, then 3 more. This is impossible. His officers turned to him, waiting for orders. The silence was heavy, and that was when Zellweger made a decision he never thought he'd make. Open a channel, he rasped, to the humans. Walker ducked behind cover as plasma fire sizzled past his head. He was about to lob a grenade when his earpiece buzzed. Boss, you're going to want to hear this. He frowned. Patch it through. A voice crackled in his ear, alien yet strained. This is Admiral Zellweger of the Galactic Council fleet. I wish to, a pause, then unwillingly negotiate. Walker blinked. Well, that was new. He clicked his mic say again. A long silence. Then, I request terms. Walker couldn't help it. He laughed. The mighty Galactic Council, the overlords of half the galaxy, the ones who had mocked humanity as nothing more than primitives, were now begging for terms. God, that was satisfying. He let them stew for a second before responding. All right, Admiral. Here's our term. A pause. We win. You lose. And then he cut the channel. Because humans don't negotiate with executioners. The final battle came like a storm. Walker's team went in with everything. Tactical explosives, ambush tactics, sheer ruthless ingenuity. The Paladins, elite as they were, had never fought an enemy that thought like this. They expected a last stand. They got a hunt. They expected a battle. They got a slaughter. By the time the sun rose, the Paladins were dead. Their bodies littered the battlefield, their advanced weapons now in human hands. And in orbit, Admiral Zellvacher stared at the burning wreckage of his forces. His hands trembled. His fleet was intact. He could order another attack. He could bombard the planet until nothing was left. But he knew, in his bones, it wouldn't change anything. Because the humans would never stop fighting. Because humans don't surrender. Because humans don't break. And now, the galaxy would have to learn that lesson too. Admiral Zellvacher's tendrils curled in quiet horror as the transmission from the surface cut out. They had begged for terms, and the humans had laughed. They had sent their finest warriors, and the humans had butchered them. The silence aboard the unyielding fist was suffocating. His officers avoided his gaze, their rigid postures betraying their discomfort. No one spoke the words, but he could hear them in his own mind. What now? A new transmission flared to life on the central display. Zellvacher turned, expecting another damage report, another tally of their mounting losses. Instead, a grainy, dust-covered figure appeared on the screen, one of their own, a surviving scout from the ground forces. The officer's helmet was missing, his scaled skin streaked with blood. His voice shook. They are everywhere. Zellvacher stepped forward. Report. The officer flinched at the tone. We tried everything. They don't fight like us. They don't even fight like any species we've encountered before. They adapt. They disappear. You think you've killed them, but then they strike from the dark. His breathing was ragged. They don't stop, Admiral. They don't break. They just... The officer's eyes darted off screen. And then, without warning, a blade erupted from his throat. His body crumpled, revealing the shadowed figure behind him. Zellvacher's breath caught. It was Walker, drenched in blood, his face streaked with war paint. The human leaned forward, staring into the camera. When he spoke, his voice was calm. This is Captain Walker. Your forces are dead. Your paladins are dead. Your fleet is still up there, but I have a feeling you don't have the stomach to see what happens next. He wiped his blade on his sleeve. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take your ships, your wounded pride, and your half-baked superiority complex, and you're going to leave. Now, Zellvacher stiffened. You expect us to simply retreat. Walker smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong on a man who had just survived the impossible. Oh, Admiral. He chuckled. You don't understand yet. The human leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. We're already on your ships. Zellvacher froze. A flicker of motion caught his eye, a status screen. The ship's internal security feeds flashed warnings. Unusual movement in the lower decks. Unauthorized personnel in the engine rooms. Impossible. The humans were still on the planet. They had to be. And yet, a sudden explosion rocked the unyielding fist. Warning klaxons blared. Damage reports flooded the monitors. A secondary feed flickered to life, showing armed figures already inside the ship, cutting through his crew like reapers in the dark. Walker grinned. We don't just fight on the battlefield, Admiral. The screen cut to black, and Zellvacher finally understood. This wasn't just a battle. This was extermination. The fall of the unyielding fist became legend. They tried to fight. They tried to hold the corridors, to push back against the invaders. But the humans weren't conquering. They weren't occupying. They were hunting. The ship's lights flickered. The air vents hissed with unseen movement. One by one, Zellweger's men disappeared, their screams swallowed by the void. When the power failed, so too did the last remnants of resistance. By the time the ship's bridge was breached, the admiral's hands trembled too violently to lift his weapon. Walker stood over him, bloodied, bruised, but grinning. "You should have left when you had the chance." Zellweger, for the first time in his life, felt fear. The Galactic Council convened in a state of emergency. The reports had spread across the stars. A tiny human force had obliterated an entire armada. The Paladins, the undefeated warriors of the Council, had been slaughtered. And worst of all, one of the Council's most feared warships had been taken, by fewer than 100 humans. The representatives bickered, their voices overlapping in waves of disbelief and alarm. They should not have been able to do this. Their technology is primitive. How did they even board the ship? How do we respond? Silence fell. No one had an answer. Then, from the shadows of the chamber, a single figure stepped forward. Old, weary, a veteran of 1,000 wars. His voice was steady. "We recognize their sovereignty." Gasps filled the hall. "Madness," a Vernati delegate hissed. The elder warrior did not waver. "We have two choices. We wipe them out completely. Every last human, every last colony, no matter the cost." He exhaled. "Or we admit the truth." The silence was suffocating. "They are not weak," the elder continued. "They are not insignificant, and they will never kneel." He turned his gaze across the chamber, his voice grave. "They're like the storms of a dead world. You do not conquer them. You do not enslave them. You respect them." A long pause. Then, slowly, one by one, the delegates nodded. Earth remained untouched. The Galactic Council did not send another fleet. No threats. No ultimatums. Instead, a simple transmission arrived. A formal recognition of humanity's place among the stars. They didn't phrase it as surrender, but they didn't need to, because everyone knew. The humans had won. Somewhere in the blackness of space, Captain Walker stared at the stars. The council thought they had settled things, that they had finally understood. He smiled to himself. They had no idea. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.